but you feel like home. Yeah, you feel like home. And where you run, I will follow, 'cause you feel like home.
Hi everyone, my name is Lucy Moore, and as Chair of Right by the Sea, I want to welcome you to our 5th Right by the Sea Festival, coming to you from beautiful Kilmore Quay, County Wexford. We are delighted to be able to present an exciting programme to you, especially after the last 18 months of unprecedented challenges. Right by the Sea 2021 is the result of hard work on the part of our volunteers, plus support from our sponsors. And I want to thank especially the Arts Council of Ireland, RTE Supporting the Arts, Wexford County Council, and all our local sponsors. We sincerely hope you enjoy this event. And if you've a taste for more, please go to www.rightbythesea.ie to book other events during the festival or events that we run throughout the year. Now, I invite you to enjoy what's coming up. And I want to say thanks to you for joining us. See you all soon again.
Welcome to Licht. We're opened here now for the last 5 years. We're located on the roundabout just as you come into Kilmore Quay. We sell Wexford gelato, homemade Wexford gelato. We have our Sundays are very, very popular, and of course our traditional 99. So it's good fun, great atmosphere, and lovely having people coming and going to the shop. So we're delighted to have Right by the Sea back in Kilmore Quay this year. It's great for business at this time of the year. Usually we'd be getting quieter, but the weekend that it's on, it always brings a stir of people around, and there's always interesting people. There's a lot of writers and, people around in the afternoons and early mornings, which probably we wouldn't normally have.
I'm Anne O'Brien, and I'm a member of the Right by the Sea organising committee. I'm delighted that our community festival is so successful. This is due in no small part to the support we get from our local community, our local businesses, our sponsors and our volunteers. Thank you all.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this session of the Kilmore Right by the Sea Festival 2021. My name is Richard Hayes, and I'm delighted that you can join us for this discussion on the short story. And with us for this event are Billy O'Callaghan and Fiona Ennis. Billy is the author of 4 short story collections and 3 novels, most recently Life Sentences, and the acclaimed collection The Boatman and Other Stories. He has been the winner of the Bord Gáis Energy Irish Book Award, was shortlisted for the Costa Short Story Award and the Royal Society of Literature's Encore Award, and his work has been translated into over a dozen languages. His short stories have appeared widely in such journals as Agni, the Kenyan Review, Narrative, Ploughshares, and the Saturday Evening Post. And his new novel, which we'll talk about later, it will be published by Jonathan Cape in 2023. And most importantly, Billy is from Cork.
That's the most important thing.
Most important, we got to get that one sorted. And Dr. Fiona Ennis is from Waterford, on the other hand, and she lectures in literature and philosophy in Waterford Institute of Technology. And I'm delighted she's a neighbour of mine, both in my office here, so we know each other well. Fiona has won the Molly Keane Creative Writing Award and was one of the winners of the 2021 Fish Short Story Prize. Her fiction has been shortlisted for the Bristol Short Story Prize and the Philosophy Ethics Short Story Competition, and her stories have been published in anthologies and journals. You're both very welcome, and welcome to this virtual Kilmore. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion with you. We've titled the session "What Matters in the Short Story," but before kind of getting to that, which we'll explore over the course of the next while. I guess I just wanted to lead off with asking, why does the short story matter at all? And maybe what I'm really asking is, why does it matter to you? How come you're writing short stories?
Fiona, you can go first.
I love the tautness of the form, and I love the way in which every word matters. And of course, every word matters in your prose anyway, but in a very particular way, I think in short fiction, every word has to be accounted for. And I love the degree of tension in a short story as well, because I think the tension usually is very high, and you usually start a story quite late or as late as you can. As Claire Keegan, once said in a talk, that you start a short story as late as you can, so you're cutting into the tension quite quickly. So it's very arresting, from the outset. And I always think, if you could leave a short story halfway through, get a cup of tea, and not worry about whether you come back to it, that's the kiss of death, for a short story. So for me, it's the tautness of the form, the pitch, that degree of tension, and the way in which it encapsulates a world. And it might only just be for, a few minutes even, Berlin's story, The Jockey, or Saunders' story, Styx, they're only, 1 or 2 pages long, but yet you're in a world for that duration. So I love the being in that world just for a short space of time. And the feeling as well, because there can be such intensity of feeling in the short story as well. And it can linger a lot longer than, and usually it does linger an awful lot longer than the reading experience as well. So there's some of the reasons why I love the short story form.
I suppose the reason I love them is because they just feel like such a natural way to tell a story. Obviously they are, but I mean, I think we're programmed to, every time you meet someone on the street, you say, "Come here till I tell you." You tell them something that's after happening, and there's usually some kernel of drama in that, and so I think we're kind of naturally disposed to the short story, but also I think from a writing point of view, part of the reason why I was drawn, probably the main reason I was drawn to the short story, was for a long time I was afraid of a novel. I was afraid of the scale of a novel. And with a short story, you can really carry the thing in your head before you start to write it. You can see the sides of it. You can see the horizons of a short story tend to be close, whereas with a novel, they're more sprawling. And then also from a writing point of view, you might spend a fortnight or a month writing a short story, and you send it out into the world and nobody wants it. So you've only wasted a month. Whereas if you spend 2 years writing a novel and no one wants it, it's very hard to pick yourself up again, So I think a lot of writers start with the short story because the feedback is more immediate on it, I suppose. But even though a lot of people start with the short story, that's not to say the short story is easy. In some ways it's harder than a novel. In other ways it's easier than a novel, but it's more approachable, I think. I think that's the advantage of it. The longer you do them, the harder they seem to get to write. And maybe that's just that you put more pressure on yourself, or you're more exacting. But they're a very satisfying form. So those are some of the reasons I love the short story.
There's so much to pick up on there. Thank you both for some very rich answers to kick off this discussion. So much to talk about there. I guess I pick up on a few things. I mean, I think that idea that the short story is a kind of an approachable task for a beginning writer, let's say, I think is is very good, a very helpful idea, because I suppose when you're starting out trying to write, you have this idea that you have to write a remembrance of things past or some big thing to make a difference. But actually, it's entirely credible, if you like, to do something on the scale of a short story. But on the flip side of that, as you said, these are not easy things to write.
No.
Very, 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 very difficult to do good ones. And I guess what Fiona was talking about, that level of intensity, that kind of diamond-like intensity that comes from the compression of the form, is hard won. It's hard. I think it's hard to, when you read the greatest of short stories and the greatest short story writers like Chekhov or somebody like that, that this has really gone through the compression of his imagination. And even though it's 10 pages, it's a hard won 10 pages,
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think as well, one thing about the short story for writers that are starting out, as a form, it's a lot closer to the original idea, than a novel will be, because a novel has to take in so many other aspects. Whereas, you can read something in the paper and something can spark in your mind and you can just get a flash of an idea. Your short story doesn't have to be that far removed from the initial idea. And so that's why it's more approachable, I think, I don't know if that makes complete sense, but that's the way it seems to me anyway.
Yeah, I suppose the thing that snagged on your imagination in the first place is kind of still there at the end when you're finished in a way. Whereas I guess with a novel, and you will know better than me for sure, but certainly from reading, I remember reading a very interesting interview with John McGahern where he talked about the novel Amongst Women, and that started with a couple on a park bench in London. And then 900 pages later, he got somewhere else, and he ended up discarding all of the stuff in London altogether. And it was like 500 pages went into the bin, So that the novel, because of this scale and this kind of elaborate, this complexity, and as you say, you end up distancing yourself from that thing that grabbed your imagination in the first place. So yeah, I think as a way of engaging with writing and testing out one's capacity, if you like, I think that story is a fantastic way in. And I think you would see a lot of writers begin with a collection of short stories or begin by writing stories and then move to novels. Not that there are other writers who go the other direction. That's very interesting. I wanted to pick up on another thing that you said, though, and maybe it's you were talking about that idea that the short story has at its heart this idea of storytelling, and that, come here and I tell you, is really what is at the heart of the whole form. And I was trying to think about this before this discussion about different kinds of short stories, and some of them are certainly very narrative driven. They're very much about the yarn, this happened and then that happened and something else happened, and would you believe?
Yeah,
that was what happened at the end. That sort of thing. And yet, at the same time, I think, and it's the compression of that narrative. And sometimes you arrive in nearly at the end, as Fiona said, that's the journey of the story is kind of through that narrative in a rapid way. But then on the other hand, I think some short stories, particularly modern ones, are more impressionistic. They're more about a feeling or and you were talking about that kind of sense of intensity about the short story and about being in a moment, and that it mightn't necessarily be about the narrative or the story, but more about the kind of the atmosphere or that kind of capturing that moment in time. I don't know, does that make any sense? Is it reasonable to maybe think about those two different ways that stories can lean?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that people can sometimes, I know I certainly was quite scared of the concept of structure of story and those kinds of things, you know, when I started writing. And I think we are storytelling beings, you know, and we have to trust our capacity to know what a story is, and they can take a lot of different shapes. And, you know, as children, we wouldn't have questioned what a story is. You know, I have a 5-year-old, and she would know you know, you might read a book about facts. She's fascinated by facts, particularly around infection, disease. Coronavirus is a lot to answer for. But then she'd say, and now we'll read a story. So there's that concept of a story that we have innately. But then sometimes when we think about theory of short story, it can get a little bit frightening. And I suppose it's important to bear in mind that, you know, a theory is just a position well argued for, that we do have that innate sense of what a story actually is. And that's why it can even be so frightening sometimes to tell a yarn in a pub, because you know that the story really matters. And that's the heart of what really matters. You know, I suppose I think as well that even in terms of conceiving of our own lives and our own identity, that we view that in narrative, that we view our lives and ourselves as a story. So we say this happened and that happened, and that's the story of yourself. So we have that capacity. I think people, you know, I think certainly for me, it's just trusting that there are different types of stories to tell. There are different ways of doing a story, and that we have that sense of what a story is, and to trust that capacity.
Yeah, I suppose, you know, drama, I suppose, is, you know, we think of stories to be dramatic. We think of plot tends to be dramatic, you know, that's hopefully the point of it. But at the same time, you can have extremely quiet short stories. More of my stories than not are very quiet kind of short stories, and they're more reflective and I suppose exploring your own place in the world, it's your way of making sense of the world. So there's drama in everything, you know. There's drama in a shower of rain if you look for it, you know. And while you see, like, I don't really go into theories of things. I just sort of write by feeling, and but when I do try to think about it, I can see you can explain it one way, and you have to use terms like drama and, you know, tension and all that. But often tension can just be, you know, like, we all are weighed down with the worries of life, and they bring their tension, you know. The smallest life is full of story. It's just recognizing what the story is, you know. So it's true. I mean, everything is fodder for story, you know. You get some of the best stories they're like a mill pond on the surface, and all the tension is under the surface, and you can feel it without seeing it, you know. And I think that those are the ones that tend to linger with you, because they're the ones that resonate. You connect them to your own life, you know. You see people, and they you know, they pass you on the street. You know that they have their troubles, their issues that they're dealing with, but, you know, to look at them passing on the street, it's not apparent. So it's I suppose it's a way of connecting with the world, you know, and trying to make sense of the world and your place in it, maybe.
Yeah, no, that's very good and very, very helpful. I guess what I was trying to get at, as you said, is that there's drama in a shower of rain, you know, and I think it's this idea that the short story, while it has a kind of resemblance to the yarn that you tell in the pub, you'll never guess, that type of thing. At the same time, the short story doesn't necessarily have to be and then with kind of surprises around every corner. You know, I opened the door, and who would you believe, there was my father, who I thought was dead, and he produced a gun, and you know, it doesn't have to be kind of all pyrotechnics. And that actually, that kind of vertical drama, if you like, the drama, you know, of the inner life, and is as tense and as dramatic as the kind of you know, the sword fighting and you know, bombs going off and all that kind of stuff. So I think, no, I think that's helpful and interesting. And maybe just to finish off this section, and then we might get on to hearing some of your work. The other thing that struck me, I mean, there is an oral kind of compulsion to tell stories, particularly in Irish people. Although while we would claim to be amongst the best short story writers, I think every culture produces great short stories and great short story writers, you know.
Yeah.
But is there a tension, do you find, in your writing, particularly in writing stories, between the voice and the words on the page? You know, do you try and capture that voice, or is it really around constructing good prose, or and they're not exclusive? I wouldn't have thought.
Yeah, I think that it's both, actually. Sometimes, so I mean, I do a huge amount of rewriting. That's most of my writing, really, is just rewriting sentence by sentence, purging, just trying to get to the rhythm. I just feel like I'm planing wood the whole time. But for me, the easiest sentences to write, and the ones that need less editing, will be the ones where I feel like I've connected more with the voice of the character, and where you feel, I know this probably sounds very strange, where you almost enter the consciousness of the character. And then and it doesn't happen very often, sometimes you have to work hard to enter the consciousness, which sounds very strange, I'm sure. But when that happens, and it's rare for me now that it does, but when that happens, it feels kind of magical, and the sentences flow, and they have their own rhythm. That rhythm that I'm often seeking for when I'm actually writing other sentences, where I'm constantly planing and trying to get to that rhythm. So yeah, you know, there's that editing of the sentences and the constant rewriting, but working at trying to enter the consciousness. And I know that sounds very strange, but
yeah, it's the story that so many writers and artists indeed would tell about, you know, all of that 90% perspiration and 10% inspiration. I mean, to get to that effortlessness takes an awful lot of digging the soil, you know. I mean, you really have to plow to get to that point where it all appears so easy, you know.
Yeah, I'd say it's even closer to 99% perspiration. Yeah. It would be probably closer to the mark. You know, I suppose the way I always approached writing was, and it's still the way I approach it now, when I'm working on a story, I don't start the story until I've lived with the story in my head for quite a while, so I know what the story is about. I have it worked out in my head, and when I'm ready to write it, it's about the language. Then it's really about getting the thing right on the page. Somebody said to me once, I was always a very nervous reader at festivals, and you know, that kind of having to stand up and read your work. And somebody said to me once, if it's right on the page, you have nothing to worry about. And it was just a throwaway comment at the time, but it was a comment that I've kept with me all the time. And when I finish a story now, that's the question I ask myself: is it right on the page? If I stand up and have to read this, am I going to be cringing, you know? And it just, while I'm writing a story, I never imagine anybody else is ever going to read it. So it's just for me. I'm just working on it for myself. And I keep working at it until, like Fiona just talked about, the rhythm of the sentences, and that's so important. And it's not something you can necessarily define, but you can feel it when you know it. When it's right, you know it's right, you know. So it's something you're almost listening to the story as you're working at it. And in some ways, that's my favorite part of the whole process, is just shaping the sentences. I love that, and as soon as I finished the story, that it's completely finished, kind of lose interest in it then, you know. It's given me what it has to give me, and it's ready then to be sent out into the world. Whether anyone will ever want it or not is another matter, but you know, it's given me the satisfaction, and I wonder if that thing about the rhythm of the sentences, the way that you know it's right on the page, if that's your own voice, if that's you know, your writing voice coming out on the page, and you know, that you have to keep working at it until you know it's right. So it's an instinctive sort of an approach to it. It's trial and error, constant trial and error, you know. Even when you think a story is finished, they're never finished. Like, you know, I think it was Oscar Wilde that said, you know, stories are never finished, they're just abandoned. And there's probably truth in that. You know, you try to be as much of a perfectionist with it as you can, but you know, 6 months later, when you see the story again, you're horrified by something in it. You know, and it's amazing. You know, we all have blind spots. You know, words that are overused that you just, you know, if you saw them on the page, you'd spot, you think you'd spot it, but you never do until it's too late. So, yeah, it's a hard process in a way, but so I think you really have to love doing it, you know, to otherwise, you know, there's easier ways to get through the day than tormenting yourself with this. But it's great fun too, you know. I mean, all you're doing is telling yourself stories, you know.
Yeah.
So.
There's I'm reminded as you talk, there's a great I mean, obviously I suppose one of the most famous and the greatest short story writers from Ireland is Frank O'Connor. And there's a very interesting book came out a number of years ago of letters between himself and the editor of the New Yorker, the fiction editor of the New Yorker, called William Maxwell. And it's really a little exchange that ends up being about the art of the short story. And Frank O'Connor talks about this idea of the happiness of getting it down right. Just and that sense of I couldn't care less then after that. Once I'm happy, once I've got it down right and I know that the truth is in it, you know, and that there it is. Whether anybody reads it or the New Yorker publishes it or nobody publishes it, in a way is irrelevant. It has done its job for him. But funny enough, paradoxically, maybe the reader then takes over, and the ones that are done right actually are the ones that chime best for the reader too, you know, and it does the job for the reader as well.
Yeah, you just mentioned, well, on Frank O'Connor, he said that before he would start the story, he would tell himself the story in 4 sentences. And if he couldn't do that, then it wasn't ready to be written. So it's about clarity, I suppose. But William Maxwell had, as editor, he said that whenever a story was sent to him in the New Yorker, the first thing he would do was tear up the first page of the story and the last page of the story, because writers always start the story too early and finish the story too late. Like, I'm sure that was a flippant comment, you know, but there's some truth in it, you know, again. So
and just as a by the way, I mean, a very great writer in his own right, as well as one of the great editors, a great novelist and a great short story writer, William Maxwell. If anybody wants to check him out, you'll be thanking us. I might invite Fiona to read something, maybe to move on a little bit. So we're going to pepper this discussion with some readings from both Fiona and Billy. So Fiona, do you want to maybe set up what you're going to read and
Yeah, so this is a story called Debt. And, you know, originally I think I got the idea for the story when I was reading a death notice. It's not something I make a habit of doing, but I was particularly intrigued by this death notice because of the way in which it was phrased. The way in which it was phrased indicated that there were some sort of strange dynamics at play in the relationships and in the family relationships with the person who died. And it made me think about kind of the space between the lines. And so the first draft of this story actually began with an undertaker and his son, who was also an undertaker, sitting down to craft a death notice for somebody who died, because the family wouldn't have anything to do with the death notice. And that scene originally, that scene went by the wayside. I had started the story too early, as it turned out. And it's no harm, because a lot of the time, like, when I'm writing, the starting points can be very kind of overwrought, and if I can cut them, I will. It's when they can't be cut, that's the problem, then you have to grapple with it. So that scene went by the wayside, but it gave me the entry to the story. And so then I started writing the story. So it begins from the beginning, actually, then. So this is Debt. Derek parked the empty hearse in the car park facing the beach. The sky was grey and the strand was deserted. Brown seaweed trailed down to the water's edge. On the sand, a gull picked at a chip wrapper, and when the breeze whipped it away, the gull scurried after it. Beside the car park, the neon open sign of the chipper was flashing, and Derek ran his tongue over his lips. He looked down at his black shoes. They'd be ruined by the sand, no point in going for the walk. The sign winked at him again. There was just about enough change in his pocket for a bag of chips and a battered sausage. He'd left his lunch on the kitchen table during the latest row with his father about taking on Tom Quillen's burial. He looked at his phone. A text had come through while he was driving, and it was from his father. Get over here and give me a hand with these remains. Pick up the wreath on the way. Derek put his phone away, got out of the hearse, and walked towards the chipper. The door jangled as he pushed it open. The conversation inside stopped. Danny, the owner, stood behind the counter sipping a cardboard cup, and he raised it by way of hello. Michael Betts was there, the carnage of his empty box of chips beside him, all ketchup and chicken bones. Betts looked up and continued to suck on a wing before returning to the newspaper that was sprawled beside him. Derek stared at the menu above the counter. He was 10 cents short of getting a battered sausage. You decided yet, Derek? Yeah. I'll just have a regular bag of chips and a can of Coke, please, Danny. Danny lifted the basket of chips out of the bubbling fat and hooked it onto the side of the fryer, letting the oil drain off before shaking the chips back and forth. Betts chewed the last bit of skin off the wing, threw it into the chip box beside him, then said, So your dad is burying Quillen? Well, somebody has to. After what he did. Danny pushed the bag of chips and a can of Coke across the counter. That'll be €3.50, Derek. Derek put the money on the counter and opened the bag to shake some salt on the chips. There were barely any in it. He looked at the fryer full of glistening golden chips and nodded to Danny. Could you throw a few more in? Sure. He threw in 2 chips. That do you? Derek picked up the bag, grabbed a load of napkins and pulled the door behind him. It jangled as it closed. Derek sat down on a bench opposite the strand and ate his chips one at a time. He wondered what his mum would have made of his father burying Quillen. He must visit her grave soon. The sea breeze made his eyes water, and he wiped away tears with his salty fingers. Business was drying up, and now he and his father were only asked to do a funeral every few months. The last person they had buried was Nora Byrne 9 weeks before, and Derek and his father still hadn't received payment for the funeral. Nora's grown-up daughters kept ignoring his father's calls and texts for payment. His father's account was completely overdrawn, and that was the reason, well, part of the reason why he'd taken on Quillen's burial. Back when business was good, people could have taken a lot longer than 9 weeks to pay, and it wouldn't have bothered his father. Well, not that much anyway. It wasn't as if the Byrnes wouldn't spend money on themselves. At the funeral, all of Nora's daughters had had their hair done and had fine black dresses and coats on them. But they'd buried their mother in a coffin with a mahogany veneer, and even though it looked like the real deal, it was glorified chipboard, barely any markup in it at all. Derek's father had tried to push an American-style burial casket. They were having none of it. Too gaudy, they had said. Gaudy? The caskets are pure class, really looked the part. 4 of them they had in storage, 2 steel and 2 bronze. He'd pushed his father to buy the back and the boom, asking who wouldn't want to be a bird in one. Turned out no one did, and the yokes had cost 3,000 each. Caskets were crucifying them. Derek had even tried to sell them on eBay in Dundee, but no bites, and at the same time their hearse was on its last legs. Couldn't get the money together for a new one, and there was no way they'd be granted finance with the state of their books. Cecil, the new undertaker, had cleared them out with his easy manner and low prices. He'd worked as an embalmer in Dublin for years, but had moved back home after his dad had left him some property at the edge of town. It hadn't taken Cecil long to set himself up as a one-stop shop, offering everything from embalming to catering. He'd refused to bury Quillen, though, and he'd let everyone know it. Derek looked down at the chip wrapper. The chips were all gone. He'd barely tasted them, and only the hard, tiny, crispy bits were left. He picked them up in his fingers and licked them, more salt than chips. The napkins on his lap fluttered in the breeze, and he got up from the bench and binned them and the chip wrapper. He hoped his clothes wouldn't stink. Cartons poked out of the bin, and some gulls hovered near it, squawking. He stood a bit away from them, finishing his coke, and stared at the sea draw in and out from the shore. His father would be with the remains now, cleaning the body. Even though there'd been an autopsy after Quillen had hanged himself, Derek's father hadn't bothered getting him embalmed. No one would be asking for an open coffin. Thank you.
Good, very good.
Very good.
Excellent, excellent. I there's so much to comment on really there. But maybe just to pursue what we were talking about before you read that story, because we were talking a little bit about starting too early or starting too late, or when do you start, and we were also talking about this idea of there's the story, i.e. the plot, if you like, and then there's the story as in the atmosphere and the development. And it seems to me that just from listening that or maybe put this in the form of a question. Why did you start your story in the chipper when the story is somewhere else? It's nothing to do with it. Like it's the story isn't about chips, or it's not about a chipper or a fella getting a bag of chips. That's not the story. The story is the father and the family and the backstory. And why? And I know the answer, or as a listener, I know what took me about it. But can you talk a little bit about that? Like, why put the chipper into it at all?
Yeah, it was just a way of showing how people in the community were receiving the fact that they were taking on the burial. And I suppose in this story, there's different ways, different ways of interpreting every story, of course, there's different ways of interpreting this story. But I suppose I also wanted to kind of raise a question in the mind of the reader. Well, what has this Quillen guy done? You presume it's something very bad. And so, in story, I remember hearing Danny Denton say about the importance of through lines, that you're setting up a particular question in the mind of the reader, that the reader then will follow on throughout the story. So the reader is kind of happy to do a little bit of work. I mean, there needs to be clarity in a story, but I think that there also needs to be space in a story for the reader to follow it. Thinking of, Dermot Healy's novel, Sudden Times, that brilliant opening line, after London, it was serious. Yeah, I laid low. What happened in London? So there's this kind of, I just wanted to raise a question and just show a little bit about how the community were receiving, and also to show how Derek felt about it as well, and to set up a little bit about the dynamic between himself and his father as well.
Yeah, no, it was very, very well done. And I also thought, again, you can comment on this, maybe I'm wrong, but I think the chipper gave you the opportunity to kind of introduce sort of sounds and images that were sort of pregnant with meaning, like the jangling door. It's another way of creating tension, isn't it? Putting these sound effects or these kind of visual effects into it, or the the kind of the half empty boxes of chips, or the guy who's sitting there with his having ravaged his meal and there's bones and all. I don't know. I always find it in the short story a bit like a poem. The compression of the form means that all of these things count, all of these things matter, and they create something for the reader. And for me, I'm coming away from the story with that sense of disturbance or disruption, and that was carried by the fact that the guy went and he got a bag of chips. That scene allowed you to create that kind of atmosphere. I thought really, really well.
And I wanted him to deliberately go and not follow his father's instruction, just to indicate this is not what he wants to do. Just you go into the chipper, and then to give a sense of the reader of anchoring them in a particular space, in a particular environment.
Well, that's the other thing too, isn't it? That you can see the town because you can see the bag of chips. It sort of illuminates the whole place, and I can nearly name the chipper. You can sort of position it very well. You can, in terms of painting the landscape. I think and again, for people who are interested in writing or in investigating the short story, I think that, going back to the point you both made earlier on, that kind of compression, that the necessary brevity of the thing, I don't know, gives everything meaning. All of the parts contribute to the overall effect. So you illustrated really, really well. Yeah, excellent. We might turn to you, Billy, and invite you to give us something.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I'll just read a couple of pages from a story called The Boatman. And this story is really it's a kind of a contemplation, I suppose, or a meditation of it's the story is about a man whose child has died, and he's getting up early to go and dig the grave. There's not much more drama in it than that. It's the weight of the world sort of an idea. So I'll just read the opening couple of pages, and we'll go from there. Okay, The Boatman. Margaret's brother arrives a little after 4, coming up the yard in that lumbering way of his, still with sleep on him, and hauling 2 shovels and a pickaxe, his boots on the gravel as familiar to me as the sound of my own voice in my head, or my boat on the water, its old wood moaning among the waves. I remain at the kitchen table with a small glass in front of me and a refilled bottle beside the flat of my left hand. These past 2 nights have done for the whiskey, and I am reduced now to more homegrown poisons. But that's all right. We all have hard tastes here, and we're well used to the fire. From where I sit, I can see the staggered silhouettes of ash trees standing dense against the horizon. I drain the glass and pour again, running the alcohol to its brim, the liquid clear and illicit and full for now of the early hour, then slide it across the table in anticipation of my brother-in-law. A minute passes, the clock dropping its seconds in clicks, and if Michael seems to linger outside longer than usual, I know that it is because he is looking at the sky, the stars, and listening for the first strains of birdsong, savouring a rare morning without breeze. When he enters, his steps trying to go gentle across the hall's linoleum, some of the house's inner balance shifts. After a moment, he fills the doorway and leans against the jamb. Neither of us wants to speak yet, lacking, I suppose, the necessary words, but also because there's little left to say apart from expressions of anger, and we're both too beaten down for that. I gesture towards the glass, and he takes a couple of paces forward, picks it up in his thick fingers and drinks slowly. I watch him, then help myself to a last long, deep swallow from the bottle. Is herself asleep, he says, and I nod. They'd given her something to put her down, because after so many days awake, she was out on her feet. Now the house around us feels like a hole. She has fallen in and is still falling, and I am clinging to an edge. Everything that has gone before seems redundant now. All the efforts at survival, the love, the wasted laughter. Beth has cleaved us entirely open in her going. Without her, Margaret and I are nothing but collections of bones, emptied of worth. All I've wanted ever since the hospital had first admitted her was to be able to sit by myself and cry. But I am 28 years old and haven't spilt a tear since I was a boy, and it seems that I have lost the ability to let go in that way. Margaret weeps, hemorrhaging tears almost, but I can only stand there, helpless, not looking at her, but neither looking away. If I was a better man, I'd take her in my arms and hold her, to feel her hair unkempt in my face and eyes, and her cheeks wet against mine and hot with fever, and to know the broken-hearted heave punching through her thin body. But that's still a step beyond what I can manage. I want to be strong for her, and we both know that it's what she needs and probably what I need too, but words of comfort are stuck in my throat. We're deep in this together, and yet the world feels untouchable around me. It's as if I've been set down on a jut of reef in the middle of the sea, some small hard rock with bottomless water a step away in every direction, and there is nothing I can do but stand and watch while others around me struggle to stay afloat, and while my betters sink and drown. Outside at this hour, I know the morning well. Usually, if I haven't already cast off ahead of threatening rain, I will be loading my boat for the day. 4 is not early for me, but this morning, because we are walking into instead of away from the dawn, up the hill to the graveyard instead of off towards the shore, I see the hour in a fresh way, blushed with new colours and bearing a different burden of darkness. When I lift my head, stars come up over the brow of the hill, and as we climb are lost, and the sky in that direction melts and turns a shade of blue that seems to soften with every step, every breath. Stop there.
Thank you. Great. I suppose my maybe to sort of maybe make a technical comment as well about that, and just maybe to invite your thoughts on it. It strikes me there's two differences between the two stories, or two parts of stories that we've heard. In this sense, yours, Billy, is in the present tense. It's not I said, he said or she said, but in the present tense, and then it's in the first person.
Yes.
And that's a tricky thing to pull off technically. I think I don't know. Obviously, it's a conscious decision to write in that way. Do you want to say a little bit about that, maybe?
I suppose it's a kind of a story like this is a kind of a bearing of the soul. It's bless me, Father, for I have sinned. Which is in the present tense. I wanted to make the story feel, because the story is about death, I wanted to make the story feel alive. So I wanted the sensations of the world to be immediate, whether it's drinking poutine or, looking at the stars, or I wanted it to be within the moment, that you feel that you're alive within the moment. Those are the decisions that you make usually in the writing. Sometimes there'll be a first draft and you'll try the story in the third person and it just doesn't have what you need it to have. So it's trial and error, to get to that point. But I think the more, like Fiona talked about drafting stories, and rewriting stories, and that's what all writing is, you know. Raymond Carver, the short story writer, said that all writing is rewriting, because that's what most of it really is. And the more you rewrite, the deeper you go into the story, and you get a feel for what's needed. That story, this particular story, was an unusual one for me in the way it arrived to me, because usually the stories take a long time to emerge and form. This story dropped into my head entirely while I was on a train traveling from Beijing to Shanghai. And it's a long train journey, and I was just looking out the window, and I'd been in China for a couple of weeks, and I had been, I suppose, inland, and I don't know what I was thinking about. I was just looking out the window. It was early one morning, and we crossed, the train crossed a small river. There was a little boat, a little wooden boat on the river, a little fishing boat. And away in the distance, I just got a flash of the sea, a glimpse just between the fall of the land. And I hadn't realized until I saw that how much I'd missed a glimpse of the sea, even just in the space of a couple of weeks. And I thought about it a lot. And I suppose, nobody in Ireland is more than, I think they say no one is more than 30 miles from the sea at any point in the country. So where, I wonder if the air inland is different to the air for people that are used to being the sea, near the sea, and maybe we're salted from the inside, from, we're breathing sea air. But it was so odd. The whole story, I suppose I had been thinking some way vaguely about this kind of a story, but the whole story seemed to drop into my head. And I never usually do this, but I started writing it on the train. I had a notebook in my bag, and I wrote it on the train, on the subway crossing Shanghai to the airport, which takes about an hour and a half in rush hour, and in the airport and on the plane. And I finished a draft of the story the following morning in Heathrow Airport, and it was almost like a possession. It's the strangest thing that has ever happened to me, and I keep wishing it'll happen again, but it hasn't. So yeah, but
did it come when I mean, I can see how it came formed, as it were, in terms of the story, but did the voice come as well? Was it the voice that propelled the story?
I think it's sort of my writing voice. It's the voice that, the same voice, variations of it crop up. I'll read something else later and you'll hear a very similar voice. It's just me on the page, I think, at this stage.
Yes. No, they're fantastic examples, both of you, of beginnings, and of how diverse the short story can be, even two stories, coming out of Ireland, if you like, with very, very different, technically very, very different approaches. I think it's most interesting indeed. Could I just ask also, just to dwell on that, because I think people will be interested in this idea of, on the one hand, there's that inspirational flash that came to you, and you wrote the whole thing. You wrote a draft. Then the work begins, I guess. Trying to make sure that moment of inspiration is sort of that you continue to be true to it while making the story work. And then on the other hand, I guess there's the sheer labor of hacking the thing out of the rock, or making the, as Fiona used the metaphor, planing the wood. Fiona, do you want to say a little bit more about your process, about those revisions? how does that happen kind of mechanically? Nearly, like, what do you do? Do you get to the end of a draft first? Do you write the whole thing, or do you write a paragraph and then work that to death and then write the next paragraph? Or how does it go?
Yeah, so it usually kind of begins with an idea, and these days I'm trying to let the idea just stay for a while and build and build. And now I'd be working on something else at the same time. I don't just sit there waiting for the muse to drop, you know. So just let it just stay and kind of grow. And I'm a big believer in the subconscious actually making connections. Now, it's not to say it comes forth unwilled. It doesn't, but I'm a big believer in just letting it sit there. And then when it reaches a point of urgency, which could take a few months, I'll feel like a kind of compulsion that story has to be written. And it doesn't matter what else I'm doing, that story has to be written. Now, I'm not able to write a draft in one sitting. That's not something I'm really able to do. So what I would typically do is write, for example, one scene and then another. Now, what I found particularly during lockdown was quite helpful was actually going for walks. And I go for a walk by myself. I'll, think about maybe what I'm going to write the next day. And it's not that it's plotted, but there's an idea of something that might happen. And sometimes I might get a little excerpt of dialogue, just, a few lines. And I have, I'll always have my phone with me. So I have a WhatsApp set up to myself, and I'll write down the few lines of dialogue. And that's helpful then when I get to it the next day. But what I'll do with that writing, I'll get one paragraph, or I'll get a few paragraphs down, or a scene. But what I'll do is always when I get to it the next day is I'll take it from the top and purge it down. And that'll happen every day. Take it from the top and purge it down. And it's a way as well of just getting into the rhythm of it. It's also a way of just warming myself up for the next thing that's writing. And so it flows a little bit more easily as well. And that process then, when I come to the end of the story, it'll go through endless rewrites again, just take it from the top and just, running it through as well. So, yeah, so it's quite a long iterative process for me.
Yeah. What about for you, Billy? Is it similar?
Well, for me, I like to live with the story for a long time, as I said before. This story aside, before I start writing, I usually know, like I do a lot of my writing in my head, lying in bed. I don't sleep very well, so I 2:00 in the morning, I'm working out the stories, and I let them form themselves. They usually come from. It's less for me about ideas than team. I think team, hard word for a Corkman to say, but it's the things that are probably troubling me or keeping me awake, and I'm thinking about those, and stories tend to form around those eventually for me, and by the time I'm ready to start writing the story, I'll have a good concept of it. It'll be clear in my head. Once I sit down to write it, I rewrite as I write. I don't like moving on from a paragraph until I'm happy with the paragraph. I write very slowly, but I do almost nothing else. So the stuff does accumulate. If I'm writing a story, I'll start it. I'll be up early in the morning. I'll work for a few hours. I'll stop at lunchtime and go and do whatever I have to do. In the evening, I'll rewrite what I've written that morning. The following morning, I'll start from the beginning, and I'll continue to do that, because otherwise I find that it's not seamless. It's broken along the way. So it's really just it's a bit like waves coming up on the beach. It's just that relentless kind of rewriting. But I find that once I know the story very well, it's the Bob Dylan line, "In a hard rain's going to fall." I know my song well before I start singing. I find that's very beneficial for me. And then the other kind of thing that I use as a kind of I don't want to say a golden rule, but something to guide me along the way is I try to make the writing as vivid, or as that you can visualize it. I like the story to be something that the reader can read and have a picture of it in their head, and I find the closer you can keep to to the way things really are, to life, the better chance you have that. I'm trying to remember that line that Seamus Heaney had, that moment when the bird sings very close to the music of what happens, and I think it's that, if you can if you can make something if you can make your story seem real, if you can keep it as close as possible to, like Fiona's scene in the chipper, you can instantly relate to it. Then the reader becomes attached to the characters because of that. You're setting it, you're grounding it in a very solid scene. So I think that's something that I look for. When it comes to when the story is actually written and I'm drafting the story, it really becomes about refining the language. When I'm doing that, what I'll be reading is poetry. I'll even while I'm writing, I'll get up and I'll read a few lines of a poem, and it just gives me this heightened awareness of language. It forces me to try to do better with my own sentences. But when it comes to once the story is basically finished and it's rewriting, I like to go through it for I'll do a draft and I'll just pay attention to character. I'll do a draft and I'll pay attention to setting, and just all I'm doing is just at this point just refining details just to make them more vivid if I can. And it's just I don't think there's a right answer or a right way to do it. You keep going until it feels done.
Yeah. And I mean, what I'm struck by what both you're saying really is that the writing process is a lot of it is about listening, reflecting, if you can, it's not too fancy word, sort of discerning, and filtering and all of that kind of stuff. So the writing is not just putting the pen to paper, but there's a whole load of other stuff goes on mentally and imaginatively. And I think that idea of kind of leaving the tea bag in the cup, like to get everything, there's a sort of sense of letting the thing breathe. And I guess, I mean, and maybe this is a question, I guess sometimes it's not there anymore. I mean, once you leave it sit for a while, you realize actually there's nothing there. Does that happen?
Well, for me, it kind of doesn't. No, I found, and maybe this is why I've kind of come to the way that I do it now, that when the first few years when I was writing, I'd get an idea. I could be out in the shop or walking or something, and I'd run home and I'd start the story, and I'd be full of the joys of it. The following morning, the thing would be dead on the page. I would have lost interest in it. Yeah. So I no longer rush to start it. I want to know the story as well as possible. If at that point, if it's not worth writing, I won't write it. If it's not giving me something that I need it to be, then I just won't bother with it. Because I like to work on more than one thing at once as well. Like if I'm writing a novel, I usually have a couple of short stories that are in, I don't rush them, and I find I don't forget them. You know, once I have worked them out in my head, they're there. Sometimes they're just not ready to be written. You know, there is a time that they feel ready to be written. Like that's even true of novels. I have a new novel coming out 2023. It's finished, but that's the scheduling of it. I had the idea for that, and I started working out, you know, plans for it in 2014. And it wasn't really until last year that I was ready to. The story was ready to sit down and you know and work on. So, you know, there's always other things to be doing, and I find they just accumulate. Then, you know.
Yeah. What about you, Fiona? I mean, do you find if, you know, that process you were talking about, going for walks and letting the thing sit, does that ever sort of result in a negative outcome? You know, in that you think, you know what, this is just not interesting, or there's just nothing there, and I leave it, and I might recycle it later, but we move on.
I tend, yeah, like Billy, I tend to let things sit, and I don't kind of move on them until they feel like they have that urgency and something to really work with. So I have ideas for, you know, a few stories, and they're not going to move until, you know, something else kind of happens in my mind to connect them up with, and they're just vaguest of ideas. And then something maybe might click at some point, hopefully, and then they'll click into gear, and that'll start the process. But no, I'm not going to even go near them until that actually happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Will you read something else for us, Fiona?
Yeah, I'd love to. So this is Duck Egg Blue. Colin propped his stick against the sink and peered at the two lads clambering out of the blue van parked at the back of his house. They were late, only by 40 minutes, but still. Colin had never met them before. His nephew had sorted the whole thing out. The lanky fellow pulled on a fleece, rubbed his hands together and blew on them. The squat one zipped up a puffy-looking jacket, then glanced at the gutters. Colin closed the door leading to the hall and bedrooms. He picked up his grey coat from a nail beside the back door, and when he stepped outside, a draught hit his face and chest. His fingers fumbled with the buttons, and he walked towards the men, holding his coat closed. The lanky fellow faced the back garden. Weeds choked the shrubs, and the big trees at the top of the garden that had fallen during the hurricane still laid there. The bullocks in the neighbouring field gazed over. The lanky fellow turned. "Bitter," he said. "It is," Colm said. "My nephew went through everything with you." "Yeah, I see you have the ladder out for us." He steadied it against the bungalow, climbed to the top and looked at the fascia. "We'll do the fascia and soffit as well as the gutters while we're here. Your nephew said they need replacing too. We've it all in the van, so we'll get cracking." "Just the gutters, thanks, lads. I wouldn't be able to stretch the rest." "Wish we didn't know that before we hauled new ones down with us," the squat lad said. Colm looked at the bullocks. They'd drawn near the fence for a look and were huddled together for warmth, their white breath rising. The squat lad unloaded the new gutting from the van, and the clatter made the bullocks start. The lanky fellow unscrewed the old guttering from under the roof. Well, it wasn't that old. It had been put up 8 years before. He yanked it off, and flakes of paint flew off the fascia as the gutter came away. When the squat lad had all the new sections of guttering out of the van, he started putting the old pieces into it. Never even asked if Colm might want them for something. Not that he did, but still. Inside, the house felt colder than before. Colm nudged the heating clock on, just for half an hour, wrapped his plaid dressing gown around himself, and sat into his hard armchair by the wood-burning stove. It hadn't been lit in a long time. He wasn't able to chop wood anymore, and he couldn't really ask his nephew Shane to cut up those fallen trees. Anyway, cleaning out the stove hurt his knees. He turned on the radio beside the chair, but left the volume low. He could hear the rattle of the metal ladder across tarmac, and the lanky fellow propped it in front of the window, waved at Colm, then climbed up to one of the middle rungs. Colm nodded, picked up the Munster Express from 2 weeks before, and stared at it. Some time later, Colm hadn't heard any clanging outside for a while. Maybe they were around the front. He opened a drawer under the counter and peered under a tea towel at the envelope with the cash, then folded the tea towel back over it. Shane had been good enough to bring him to the bank the previous day to withdraw it. Colm took the biscuit tin out of the cupboard, and when he managed to get the lid off, he lifted out the top layer. The only ones left in it were the bourbon creams, which didn't count. He reached into the bottom of the tin for the last chocolate biscuit. The red jelly on top stuck to his dentures, but he managed to free it with his tongue. Most of the good biscuits on the bottom layer were gone. Only 2 jam rings and 3 pink wafers were left. He turned on the kettle, placed some bourbon creams on the table, and pushed the tin to the back of the counter. He went outside. Only the end bits of the guttering were left to do, the trickier bits. At the front of the house, the lanky fellow was up the ladder fixing a bracket, the squat lad holding on to the base. Colm nodded at them. Looks well. I'll have tea ready for you in a few minutes. Inside, he put tea bags into the blue and white striped mugs. Tea never tasted the same when it was made in a mug. But the last time he'd used a teapot, it had crashed to the floor, and some days he still found little bits of it stuck to his slippers. Men came in. Colm brought over the mugs one at a time, and the lanky fellow put 2 heaped sugars and milk into his. He didn't touch the bourbon creams, but his eyes lingered on the biscuit tin on the counter. The squat lad took a bourbon cream and said to Colm, "Pretty remote out here." "It is," Colm said. "Bad roads." "They are." The squat lad dipped the bourbon cream in his tea. "Do you ever think of selling that Honda 50? "What?" He saw through the garage window. "No." "Pity. My dad had one. Used to love spinning around on it." The squat lad finished his bourbon cream and reached for another. They're classic now. Colm looked out the window, listening to him sip from his mug. "They are cattle in the next field," the squat lad said. "No." "Ah, right." Snapped the bourbon cream in half. "Fine animals they are." Thanks.
Very good. Tension is building. I think, again, I suppose I'm lingering a bit on some of the more technical aspects of the craft that's evident in the writing. And I just wanted to ask you about that kind of, sometimes you have to color in the picture and sometimes you don't. And it struck me there you talked about, it was the lanky lad or the squat lad. You didn't kind of have to bother in those cases filling out those people with names and backstories, you know. And it struck me in that sense then that allowed the gravitational force of Colm to be the, you know, that he's the one holding the story, you know. And then at the same time you zoomed in on particular details, the Munster Express. You didn't say just biscuits and bourbon creams, you know. I thought that was really interesting how you kept and I think just as you were talking there, and indeed reading, you've talked already about constructing scenes, and that the story is a kind of a series of scenes. So there's a kind of a very visual method, if you like, going on where you're zooming in on a particular detail, whether it's a bag of chips or the hard bits at the bottom of the chip bag, or whether it's a bourbon cream or a biscuit with a jelly, which we all know is a very particular was one of the selection, you know. So I don't know, do you want to say anything about it? I'm just making an observation, but I think that change in focus almost is really an interesting way of creating the tension and creating interest and that vividness that Billy has talked about.
Yeah, and I suppose in this story there is attention to the food as well, and the biscuits are actually doing a bit of work in the story, because later in the story, you know, he's wondering, you know, where the jam ring is gone, and well, he's not wondering, he thinks that it's been taken. And this is actually an important part then of the story, because one thing I wanted to do was to set up feelings of threat in the story. And so actually when I was writing the story, I was thinking, okay, I could go one particular way where the threat that seems most obvious is realized. And then I could go another way where the threats perhaps are coming from somewhere else. And that's the way I kind of wanted to go then with the story, was to use other sense of threats that are kind of planted, in the story, but not fully realized really until the end. And it was a story actually that I found incredibly hard to title. It was the hardest story I've ever had to title. Right before I submitted it, it had an awful title called Repairing Home, which was meant to be repairing the gutters, but also the fact that by the close of the story, spoiler alert, he won't be going home. He won't be repairing home. But it was awful, I was just like, oh, I have to come up with something better than this. So I kind of lit on Duck Egg Blue, which I was happier with, but titling as well is just something that's tricky, and it's just something that you have to grapple with,
I wrote that down. I was going to ask about the title, like where and how where does the title come from? I mean, it's obvious in a story like, as you said, like the boatman is the boatman. It's about the boatman. It's kind of it's sort of self-evident, but although at the same time, I guess, I mean, there can be something maybe pedestrian about titling it literally. It's this, and but how do you go about finding those titles? I mean,
I like the title to do a little bit of work. Usually, I remember hearing Paul McVeigh talk about titles being a Rosetta Stone, that they can have different types of meanings and different types of levels, so like that, like Duck Egg Blue just refers to the particular shade of the paint that his nephew's wife wanted to paint his solid oak kitchen doors, and this kind of has a particular resonance in the closing scene. But yeah, actually, another story that I wrote, Claim, I wanted it to work on a whole lot of layers as well. And obviously, people interpret different things from a title, but they can be tricky. And deciding which of, you might have a few titles going, and you might say which one is the best. It can be difficult to know sometimes,
I like that idea, though. I mean, and again, it goes back to the notion of compression and concision in the short story, and that everything has to earn its place there, whether that's a scene or whether and you've talked about purging, getting rid of all of the kind of extraneous material. And I guess if everything is earning its place, then the title should earn its place too, and really work, whether that's to focus attention on a particular character or idea, or Billy, do you want to read something else and maybe reflect on that titles question there as we go?
Yeah, okay. Right, I'll okay, I'm going to read a piece, just a couple of pages from a story called Wildflowers, and it's again, it's a bit, these are what I've picked out. I picked out another one that's a little bit more dramatic as well, but this is a kind of a meditative piece as well, but sure, I'll just read it. And okay. The evening had turned languid, and the dead smut of earlier rain cloud lingered now only as a memory in the east. Weather for sitting out, he thought, pausing once just where the ditch on his right side broke for a 4-rung gate, its iron rusted down to the maroon marrow of old blood. Weather for sipping a glass of cold beer and savouring the end part of another day well spent. He leaned on the gate's top rung, stopping not because he was out of breath, though he was, but so that he could savour the spill of the land, the misshapen fields empty except for patches of the same measly yellow grass that grew everywhere on the island at this time of year, and the dappled blue glass stretch of the ocean. As a young man, he'd thought often about the things that must lie on the other side of the horizon line, but having fished that water almost from the time he could stand up in a boat without needing to be held, the lesson time and tide had taught him was that the sea went on without end, with neither bottom nor sides. Beyond the horizon there could only ever be more of the same. That saddened him, especially when he saw others go, friends, neighbours' children, because their leaving caused him to remember again how he'd had his own heart taken that one time and drowned, and because he'd come to understand that there was nothing to be said, no words of warning that they'd heed. The whispering promises of the surf and the gold and silver that flecked the water's surface were a lure, tempting the curious-hearted away from solid footing. But those who took the bait would have to learn for themselves the hard way, the way everybody did. He continued to smile, forcing it now, until the sadness receded and the day was again sweet. On impulse, and in turning away from the gate, he stooped and plucked some strands of goldenrod and red campion, and as an afterthought, a few wild roses, their white petals blushing a touch pink in places. Then, flowers in fist, he continued up the road, whistling the first airy strains of a tune he knew as the minstrel boy, to the little cottage set so neatly into the hard sweep of ground that it lay entirely hidden from view until you came within barely 5 paces of its front door. "Hello," he called, pushing his way inside without bothering to knock. The door, as always in hot weather, was ajar. After the sunshine of the hill road, the hallway, which led in from the side of the house and divided the tiny building fairly neatly in half, had a gloom that encouraged sighs. To his left, just inside the door, was an immaculately white late edition bathroom, complete with toilet, sink and shower, that had been converted only in the early 1980s from a small box bedroom, and further along, another slightly larger bedroom. A shadowy room that across the span of some 5 generations had known 17 births and probably a dozen final breaths. "Hello," he called again, raising his voice a little and feeling its heft out of place in the hallway. "Are you here at all?" "I'm here," an old woman's voice answered after a couple of heartbeats, from ahead and to his right, pitching without effort, though tinged with impatience. "I'm still here." She was sitting in the armchair beside the living room's empty fireplace, and he knew at a glance that he'd woken her from sleep. He lingered within the frame of the room's doorway and felt his eyes drawn to the 2 small windows opposite. The light in here was soft and dull, diffused and made shadowy by the thin fleece of net curtain. "There's a nice bit of sun out now," he said. "That drop of rain from earlier is after making the evening grand and clean. You should bring a chair outside for an hour. It'd do you a power of good." "Was it weeding you were?" she said. "What? Oh, these." He smiled at the posy of flowers still in his fist. "I saw them on the way up and thought they'd brighten the place a bit for you. The ditches are full of colour." I'll stop there.
Lovely, lovely. That's terrific. Terrific. Thank you, Billy. I suppose I'm struck again as you're reading. You mentioned that you read poetry when you're trying to finish the thing out, or as you're in a certain phase. What are you looking for in a poem when you go and read it? I mean,
I'm not really looking for anything specific. I just tend to take them as they come. Like I don't try to read things that we're supposed to read. I just read whatever appeals to me, because my feeling is that if I'm drawn to something, that it has something that I'm looking for. If I like a particular writer, then there's something in that writer's writing that I'm I'm in need of. So all I really want when it doesn't even matter. It doesn't have to be a whole poem. It might be just a verse or something. It's just to give me a heightened awareness of language, so that when I sit back down in front of my own story again, I don't settle too easily. I push myself a little bit. If I read Seamus Heaney or Patrick Kavanagh or something like that, it just makes me that much more aware of my own sentences, and it just forces me to do better, I think. So that's the only reason I do it.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, and a useful tip in a way, that people can and feel that if I'm writing short stories, I should be reading short stories in order to get better at them. But actually, that there's all sorts of writing that can help, you know.
Well, I mean, I would also advocate that people, if they're writing short stories, they need to read a lot of short stories, because you know, you learn the shape of them, you learn the mechanics, you know, and it's the best way to learn is just by reading. You learn by reading, you learn by doing, I suppose, you know.
Yeah. I guess for fear people would think that condemns them to a lifetime of you know, the one thing. I mean, as we said already, the short story is such a diverse form that you can read a writer like Raymond Carver with his hard-boiled, kind of terse and you know, very, very plain sort of prose, and then you can read Alice Munro with these kind of hugely novelistic kind of epic, but yet short stories, and there's very, very different artists. Or in Ireland, say somebody like William Trevor is very, very different than Frank O'Connor, you know, just in terms of feel and all of that. So there's so much out there, isn't there? There's such variety in the form, really. Who would your go-to writers be, Fiona, just as a matter of interest?
I love Elizabeth Strout, actually, and she's probably better known really as a novelist. But her works, Olive Kitteridge and Olive again, you know, in particular, there'd be a bit of debate about whether they're interlinked short stories or whether they're novel, and I view them as a hybrid. And each of, because, you know, the chapters are written from a number of different points of view, but each of them are perfectly executed short stories. And I adore her writing in the same way that Billy reads poetry, and when he's trying to, you know, refine prose, I read her sentences, because you know, she's spoken about how she just crafts and crafts and crafts at the sentence level. And then when you read her prose, it's completely effortless. I also love Wendy Erskine's work. Her collection, Sweet Home, is phenomenal. One of my favorite stories is in that collection, The Soul Has No Skin. There's also a wonderful story in that collection, To All Their Dues, which is written from 3 different points of view. And it's just a fascinating exercise in form as well. So it's wonderful to have such, you know, a diverse range really just to draw from when reading fiction.
We're rapidly going to run out of time. So, and I want to ask you both to read some more. But I was going to just ask a little bit about publishing, really, and that end of the business, if you like. I mean, we've talked, and it's been really fascinating. We've talked about, you know, the labor of love that is writing the piece, the satisfaction you get out of it, the internal mechanics of the story, the language, and the attention to the language, getting the thing right, getting it to start at the right place, finish at the right place. We might talk about endings with time, but I guess there's another side of it, which is then the reader and passing it on to the reader and letting the reader do something about it. And as you said earlier, I think Billy was saying it, it's in a sense, that's a whole other business nearly, because you brought it to its completion for yourself, and that has its own satisfaction, that's pleasure. But nonetheless, you're compelled to publish it. I mean, it's not as if you're writing and then saying, I'm satisfied with that now, and then that goes into drawer, and I'll do the next one, and that goes into drawer. It is a public art. It is something that is, I feel, even if it's not declared, I feel it's not complete until it's read. You know, I remember somebody years ago saying to me, a writer is somebody who has readers, you know, and that I think there's a truth in that. So when it comes to, I mean, you've both published, you've both been successful in competitions. How important is that whole part of it, apart from the massive lucrative money that comes rolling in, right? I'm not, because I think publishers probably say there's not a lot of money in short stories, but I mean, how important is that whole phase of recognizing it's a whole different element, and then maybe just to sort of throw into the mix as well, there's the actual business of it, really, where you say, I finished a novel, it'll be published in 2023. You know, it's years away when you'll actually see the book. I mean, maybe could you both reflect a little bit on that whole, the public end of the writing, putting the thing out there?
For me, I suppose getting recognition was important for me. You know, particularly a couple of years ago when I was juggling work. I have young kids, and you know, I was writing, you know, late at night, and I was kind of saying, is it any good anyway? So from that point of view, I was glad to get a little bit of recognition there in that respect. But I've also, thinking about it since, I've also come to the realization that it has to be the thing in itself too. I love writing. I get great pleasure from writing, and if nothing I wrote is ever published again, it still gives me pleasure. You know, if I took up golf, just because I'm not Tiger Woods, you know, I mean, I don't golf, but I mean, that would be enough in itself, I would imagine, to golf. So for me, it is the thing in itself. It gives me great pleasure. It gives me great peace. And even, I think, even in terms of just worrying about things, I'd be a natural worrier by nature. And I realized that part of that is actually my imagination going crazy. And so when I write, my imagination is funneled into something that is a lot more positive than worrying about the things that could happen that don't actually happen. So it's something that I thoroughly enjoy, and it is the thing in itself for me, although it's lovely to get published too. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose for me, while I'm writing the story, there's nothing, only the story. There's nothing, I'm not thinking about where the story will go or who will see it. In fact, I don't ever allow myself to imagine that anyone will see it until the story is done. And once it's done, you know, it's a bit like, you know, those handprints in the caves. It's like somebody reaching out from the distant past. You know, you want connection. You know, you want the work to connect in some way with someone else. And so out into the world they go. Rejection is a big part of it. It's you know, it's part of life, and the only way you can deal with that is to be relentless. You know, you throw enough muck at the wall, and some of it will stick eventually. For me, the first short story that I ever had published was in the Hollybow, which is a Cork Christmas newspaper. It's been going for about, I'm sure Moses had a short story in it. It's been around forever, but that was the biggest thrill that I've ever had. You know, from childhood, that was the sort of signal of Christmas, was the Hollybow. So as soon as the Hollybow was out, I knew it was coming up to Christmas. And to get a story into that was, I felt like Stephen King. And I've never had quite the same level of high that I got from anything else. But, you know, along the way, because there's so much rejection, you do need the odd acceptance, you know, a bit of validation, I suppose. At this stage, no, like I've been very lucky with the stuff that I've had published over the years, and I've been at it now. It's like over 25 years or something, and it's only now that I'm starting to feel that what I'm doing isn't a complete waste of time. But there's still, there's never a day that I don't have doubt. There's never a story, when I finish the story, there's never a day that I'm confident that this story is going to do great things. It's just, it is what it is. It's done. It's to the best of your ability, and out into the world it has to go. It's the same with novels. You know, you send them off hoping that they'll be accepted. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. You get an awful lot of knocks in this business, but it's, you know, if it's what you want to do, and if it's the only thing you can do, then you just have to do it. The timeline of the thing, you know, can be a blessing and a curse, because you know, you'll be working on something else, so that by the time a novel comes out, you'll be finished or nearly finished the next one. You know, the thing moves so slowly. So you're always, you know, in advance of the way the world actually is. And it becomes difficult to have to talk about your new novel when you've just written another one in between, and it's no longer the thing that you know, while you're writing it and in the time before you started writing it, you're all consumed by it, and it's the only thing in your head. But when it's done, you have to put it aside and move on to the next one. And then when you have to try to remember characters' names, and you know, you think that you'd never forget, but you know, I suppose it's necessity. You have to just clear. It's like, you know, it's like clearing your desk, you know. So it's like it's not an easy thing. Like to be honest with you, I'm convinced that writing is something that anybody can do if they are willing to apply themselves to it, to, you know, to a necessary sort of it's within everyone's capability. That's the point. It's just not everyone is willing to do the amount of work that it takes to get it done. And that's all there is to it. You know, it's I don't want to make it sound as if it's easy, right? But there's far more writers in the world than there are brain surgeons and rocket scientists. So writing isn't brain surgery, and it's not rocket science. It's, you know, it is something that people can do. And, you know, you set your own bar, you know, like Fiona talked about golf. You know, you know, you might set out to become Tiger Woods, or you mightn't. You might just set out to enjoy a game of golf. And that, you know, that's like, there's writing groups the length and breadth of the country, and you know, they get pleasure out of it, and you know, that's all I can say really about it.
We're going to have to wrap it up, and
okay.
I thought we'll finish with I'll ask you to read something else, both of you, just to finish on the practice rather than on the theory, if you know what I mean. So maybe Fiona, do you want to read something by way of conclusion?
Thanks very much. So this is Claim. In the tiny room that's used as a staff canteen in Halden Insurance, you take 2 Ribena out for your lunch, snap one in half, then put the bigger half back in your lunchbox. Maura licks the egg mayonnaise that's spilling out of her sandwich as she watches you slice a tomato. She'll probably make some comment about you being too thin again. Her dark blonde fringe, sprayed to the last, stands up straight over her forehead, and you can see where the teeth of the comb are pulled through the strands. The rest of her hair is back-combed. She thinks she looks like one of the Bangles or something. The last time she gave you a lift home when it was raining, she played Manic Monday, then fast-forwarded the tape to Walk Like an Egyptian, doing the hand actions when she stopped at the traffic lights. Sean, your boss, asked her last week to tone down the hair a bit, look more professional when she's talking to clients. Not that her hair bothered him as such, he'd said. She had to think of the company image. Most days she slicks her hair back with that wet look gel, but not today, as she's heading out for drinks after work. Not that he'll say anything. She'll probably end up in Club Tempo after. It's free in for women on Thursdays. Ladies' night. She'll be dying in the morning again. The kettle shudders on the countertop and clicks just as Sean walks in. He nods at you, the usual. Yep, thanks. He puts a teaspoon of coffee into the red mug and another into his special mug. Maura points a frosted pink nail at your plate. Don't know how you can be full of 1.5 Ribena. Still, it's a quarter more than you had yesterday, isn't it, Niamh? And Sean, since you're asking, I'll have a cup of 2. He throws a bag into the yellow mug with a chip off the side, then says, that's why she's so lovely and thin, isn't it? He smiles at you and his eyes graze over your legs. You pull at your pencil skirt a bit. Then he says, did you know Greta Garbo used to endure her legs for millions? Maura puts down the crust of her sandwich. Yeah, I heard Tina Turner does that. Don't know if it's true. Imagine if we got a call from someone around here looking for that. As he sits down beside you, You move your chair and say, imagine the actuary's working out that one. He says, I don't think the premiums would be too high somehow. That evening, Maura is in the bathroom, fixing up her makeup before she hits the pub. The office phone rings, 10 to 5, typical. This had better not hold you up. You're starving and you have to do your aerobics video before dinner. You say, hello, Haldon Insurance, Neve speaking, how may I help you? The woman's voice said, Neve, glad I got you before closing. It's Margaret, the Bishop's secretary. What can I do for you, Margaret? Let's see. The diocese is a huge account. This could take ages. Well, she says, we're trying to insure against all sorts of risks. There are a lot of people against the church these days. Dreadful, isn't it? Margaret's voice is barely loud enough to hear. People are making all sorts of allegations against a few of the priests. Imagine, after they've given up their lives for the church. We'll have to take some unusual cover out, she says, in the interest of the diocese, and the priest too, of course. Right, what kind of policy, Margaret? Your shoe is chafing your right heel, and you slip it off and dangle it from your toes. She says, one that protects the diocese against liability arising from sexual abuse of children by priests. Excuse me? Your shoe falls to the floor. Is there a problem? No, of course not. A while later, you knock on Sean's office door. Come in. He's sitting at his desk and smiles when you enter. Shouldn't you have gone home by now? I'm working you too hard. Pay rise. He lets out a breath through his teeth. Yeah, right. Feels like the economy's never going to pick up. He indicates for you to take a seat, then sits back in his chair and rakes his finger through his hair. You sit and pull your skirt over your knees. I just got a call from Margaret, the Bishop's secretary. Oh, yeah? Where are you going to put this? She was inquiring about a policy to ensure the diocese against liability for sexual abuse of children by priests. What's that now? He sits forward and puts his hands on the desk. A policy to protect against liability for sex abuse of children by priests. Right. He rubs his forehead. You say, let's report it. He taps his pen on the desk and stares at it. No, we won't be doing that. Neve, we protect against liability. Just because we insure a house against fire doesn't mean it will go on fire. This is just protection against case claims are made. Insurance 101. You believe that. His neck is mottled. You can't cast aspersions on people's characters, least of all on our clients. Better keep it to yourself. Then he opens a desk drawer. I have a stack of CVs here from girls just like you. You'd have no prospects on the dole queue. You know yourself, factories are closing up and down the country. You watch as he closes the drawer. It feels like it happens really slowly. Then he looks at you, like really looks at you. Neve, I don't want to lose you. Just do the paperwork tomorrow. There's a good girl. You'll keep any document out of Maura's sight. You know what she's like. You get up from the chair and close the door behind you. After the 40-minute walk home from work, you let yourself into your bedsit. You hate waking up in the same room as your fridge and TV, and the rent is high considering the flowery wallpaper is peeling and the carpet is lifting away from the skirting board. A loud grumble comes from your stomach, but you've always been like that, wanting to eat because something's eating you. You preheat the oven, change your clothes, and rewind your Jane Fonda video. This should take your mind off things. By the time the video is over, your lean cuisine sweet and sour chicken should be ready. At least you don't need a microwave for this flavour, even though the rice gets hard in the oven and tastes like little pellets. You've learned not to leave the third you don't want on your plate. Well, it's not that you don't want it, but you always put it in the bin before you even sit down. Thank you.
Very good. I kept thinking of when somebody pulls back a string on a bow and arrow, you hear the creaking, the tension, and I can see why we began the discussion. You were talking about tautness and tension and all of that, and I think it's you've really shown how it's done there. Thanks so much, Fiona. Billy, I'm going to leave the final word to yourself.
Right. Okay. I'm going to read the end of a story called Ruins, and it's about a couple that aren't quite a couple. Okay, I'll just read it and we'll be done. Okay. On the morning of her flight, I woke to an empty bed. It was still dark, which would have put the time at somewhere between probably 4 and 5, and at first I lay there feeling bereft. I listened for the sound of her, but the radio in the corner of the room was playing low, a rope of old songs, the words and melodies of which kept her hidden. Early Tom Waits, Cohen's Suzanne, Marianne Faithfull singing Ruby Tuesday. Music made with the smallest hours in mind. Outside my window, rhapsodies of gale pulled at the jagged top of a young roadside hawthorn. And even though the glass kept the sound at bay, the wind's ferocity set the few scattered stars to shimmering and made shreds of the night. Even without May in the room, her presence blocked out the space the way sand fills an hourglass, turning everything slow. That's how I wanted it to be, and that at least was what I'd have. But I knew from before, from having already lost her once, such ghosts tormented as much as consoled. We'd taken an important step in reconnecting and had sworn that we wouldn't let it flag. So it would be much different this time, better, if still a long way from ideal. But keeping our promise meant condemning ourselves to a famished life, to the scraps that could nourish only the most fragile of hearts. In taking from a kind word and a smile far more than such gestures could ever truly give, we were committing to a delusion. But survival for most people owed an immense debt to lies, because lies were what kept us all still swinging long after the fighting was done. At the airport a few hours later, I stood with her in line to clear security, holding her hand, whispering to her how much I'd miss her until we could see each other again, and how we had to promise to email every day and to call one another at least twice a week. She looked sad and serious, and I knew that she was fighting to keep herself together. And in her face I saw an exact reflection of the way I felt. It was in my mouth to ask if she might change her mind, if she'd throw aside her morals and stay with me. She'd already given up so much for a situation that could only ever worsen, and with me there was at least a chance at happiness. But she'd heard these thoughts from me too many times. When it was her turn to pass through security, we kissed goodbye. The press of her mouth was familiar and gently firm, and tears spilt down her cheeks and onto mine. Tears that had come in floods for hours more on the plane, with her face turned in a vain attempt at privacy to the small window, looking out on the scarred tundra of rain cloud. I watched until she slipped away and out of sight, and the void was exactly as I remembered. I sat for a while with a paper cup of coffee in one of the airport cafes, and it was easier to pass the time there than at home, because the apartment would seem hollow after her, and at least in the airport it was possible to feel that she was still close by. But an hour later, after the departure screen listed her flight as having left, I left too. I was limp inside, and home proved as bare and haunted as I'd feared, the silence a kind of roar around me. Trying to busy myself, I cooked something, chopping and stir-frying chicken, a sliced green pepper and green beans, favouring this because it kept me at the stove. Later, once night had taken hold, I switched on the computer and wrote a little, not concentrating, just letting it flow, the way I always did when things turned particularly difficult. Because this, as anyone who has ever had their heart broken by love knows, is how it has to be. The tide comes in and then recedes, and we stand and wait for it to come again. So much of life is waiting, but even ruined as we are, waiting at least makes room for dreams.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. That's a great way to end, and really, really lovely. Thanks so much to you both. I really enjoyed the conversation and learned a lot, and great food for thought in your reflections on the art form and on the business of writing. So, food for thought from your generous participation in the discussion, and food for the soul in the work that you've read. So, on behalf of our audience out there and on the festival, thank you so much to Billy O'Callaghan and Fiona Ennis for such a great, rich discussion. Really appreciate it. And to anybody out there, just to encourage you to go to more events in the Right by the Sea Festival. If you're particularly interested in fiction and fiction writing, you'll be interested in the conversation with Christine Dwyer-Hickey and Derek Hand. It's scheduled for Friday, the 24th at 7. You'll also be interested in the conversation the following night on Saturday between Colm Tóibín and Andrew O'Hagan, also at 7. And Colm Tóibín and Peter Murphy will talk about mythologies and the use of archetypes in fiction at 5 on Sunday. So these are all events that are to those of you interested in the short story and in fiction would probably find very interesting indeed. Booking and more information, rightbythesea.ie. Thanks again to Billy and Fiona, and good luck to everybody.
Thanks so much, Richard and Billy. Really enjoyed it.